We're just 8 days away from Oklahoma football. We always enjoy the conversation with Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football, talking up the Sooners and by extension, the Big 12. Jason, it looks like we're going to have college football. Like, we haven't quite hit the finish line, but it looks like we're going to get there.
Yeah, it does. I know that we've talked so much during the summer and obviously late spring as well. Definitely questioning whether we would get here or not, but with a couple of games that happened last night, and then over the weekend, that we have about 5 or 6 games tomorrow that are going to start, and then the full Big 12 schedule gets kicked off next week. It looks like we've, barring any late breaking collapses, I think we've made it at least to the starting line.
Before we check out the Sooners and the rest of the Big 12 contenders, it's quite a challenge that these coaches and these coaching staffs have had to deal with over the past several weeks in finally seeing these players face to face for the first time in months and months and months, especially when we're talking about whatever's new on the team, whether that be a new offensive or defensive coordinator, a new position coach, obviously the new freshman on campus, a new starting quarterback. In places like Florida State, Colorado, and Michigan State, we have a new head coach and other places as well. For Lincoln Riley, obviously his plan, his terminology, his schemes are in place. And for a second consecutive year, the same defensive coordinator in Alex Grinch.
Right.
But all sorts of new issues to deal with in regards to not just preparing a football team to play football, but keeping them safe.
Yeah, Mark, I think it's really interesting, and I think it's going to be a testament to many of these coaches this year on how they're able to handle that. Look, there's no blueprint. There's no, as a younger coach, Riley can't go to someone like Bob Stoops or even Barry Switzer. Hey, how would you recommend handling this? This is new territory for everyone. So you think about how they prepare their team on the field, through practice, how you get better from game to game. But then, a big part of it is how are these coaches going to be able to handle, the testing? I think most conferences, including the Big 12, will start, next week, game week, starting 3 tests a week. I can't remember exactly what days those would be on. I don't know if the Big 12 has actually released that, but there will be 3 tests each week. How do you navigate if you have 3 or 4 people at a position that are going to have to be out for, a couple of weeks, or if you have contact tracing individuals that are going to have to be out, I think it's going to be big from a depth perspective. I think that's really something that we talk about, obviously, from an X's and O's perspective every year, talk about how important depth is, but I think it takes a whole new meaning this year when you look at things like that. I mean, I think there's, you might see a lot of teams have to use walk-ons, to a certain extent. If you have people at a certain position that are quite a few people that are out, you may have to look at that and, what does that look like if you have a big position group. If you're going against Missouri State, maybe not as big of a deal, but 3 weeks later you're going, against Texas on October 10th. What does that look like? Not only in the Big 12, but across the country. I think it's a nuance that's going to keep coaches up much more than they already were, kind of thinking about how to handle this season.
Lincoln Riley, to extend on your point, is the first head coach that I heard talk about versatility, building that into practice and in terms of the positions, and looking at defensive backs who could possibly flip over to wide receiver and vice versa, and matching those positions that have like skill sets to try to provide that versatility. So obviously that's a factor in that as well, as you've discussed.
Right. And that's absolutely right. There was a couple articles that I read that, we're most certainly at some point through the season with some team, you may see teams go back to have people play on both sides of the ball, which is unheard of in this day and age in major college athletics, college football. But it might be something that has to happen at some point through the year. For these teams. And, Riley has been very transparent, kind of with the amount of positives that they've had. Oklahoma did really well kind of through that fall conditioning period where they were allowed to start back up in July. And then he let the team out for a couple of weeks, and then they came back with about 9 positives. So I think one of the things that's going to be interesting this year is, do you give these kids a break at all? They're off. The teams have built in multiple bye weeks throughout the year. What do you do in that situation? Do you let these kids go be kids and take a few days off and let them go home, or do you have to kind of keep them on campus? And I think the players, Mark, are getting to a point where they understand the importance of being safe, following the protocols, maybe not necessarily going to parties, and just making better decisions. It's kind of funny telling college kids not to go to a party, especially on an off weekend. But I think these kids know what's at stake right now. They understand the gravity of the situation, and obviously the coaches do. But we're going to see a new game, especially early in the year. Watching that FCS game, I think what you'll see is, early on, with the lack of a spring practice and the spring program, and then the fall getting broken up, between a lot of teams had to stop, pause workouts for quite some time. I think you'll see a bit of sloppiness early on, and it'll be interesting, especially as you look at the Big 12 has a bit of a warm-up game, specifically Oklahoma with Missouri State. But when you look at the SEC, they're starting their first week is their conference game. So it'll be interesting how that unfolds as we start the season.
Please like the videos, share them on social media, and subscribe right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. You hit the bell for the notifications and know when we go live, which is just about every day. Head on over as well to Last Word on College Football. Join Jason and Tony and Kevin and the crew over there covering college football. And the tremendous job that they do helping me out in support of what we do here. Oklahoma, all right. You lose your best player on defense. You lose your best corner. You lose your top running back in regards to rushing yards over the past 3 seasons at least. And, of course, CeeDee Lamb was one of the most prolific wide receivers in college football. And, quarterback, 50-touchdown guy there, but you've got a 5-star stepping in. So a lot of changes, but typical changes for most college football teams. So we take the offense for granted. Right. And in a sense, we take the defense for granted, Jason, as being marginal. But as you overlook both sides of the football and maybe even special teams, what concerns you? What do you have questions about?
I think there's a certain amount of trust that you put into Lincoln Riley's offense over the years. He's not, obviously, at Oklahoma, he's not had a bad offense. And really before that, East Carolina, he's always put up, good offense. So I think, first of all, you have an initial level of trust with Riley in terms of what he's going to be able to put on the field. But at the same time, kind of going back to our previous point, he didn't have spring practice to kind of teach and let those newer kids learn, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Certainly a quarterback would be a bit of a concern. I think there's a lot of people that have faith and confidence in Spencer Rattler to do the job, but you got to be able to do it when you're the guy. I think if there's one area on the offense that I would have a concern with, it is the depth at the running back position. You'd mentioned the loss of Kennedy Brooks. He decided to opt out of the season a few weeks ago. Then you have Trey Sermon, who transferred to Ohio State in the offseason. And then you have Ramondre Stevenson, which is at this point suspended for about 5 games this year. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out if the suspensions still stay, with the new rule that this is basically a wash from an eligibility season. So I think you're probably looking at TJ Pledger, who's been in the program for about 3 years, who's the guy Riley said in his initial press conference earlier this week, that Pledger has been the most consistent out of the running back room. And then you got a couple of new guys that haven't played at all. You got Marcus Major, who was a redshirt freshman last year, only had about 10 carries on the year. And then Seth McGowan, who was a true freshman this year out of Texas. So a couple of those guys are going to be counted on early on to play. I think, the thing that you would kind of rest your hat on as something that's, from an optimism perspective, is the offensive line is returning a lot. They have 5 starters returning from a year ago. Bill Bedenbaugh, really one of the best in the business from an offensive line coach perspective. He's not really quick to hand out compliments over his years, in my experience, and just kind of listening to him and preseason interviews. But he's gushed a bit about this offensive line, specifically some of the newcomers. I think Anton Harrison just is a name that that Oklahoma fans would be interested in knowing. True freshman, as of Oklahoma has scrimmage on Saturday, he was the starting left tackle. So I take that with what you will. I think the offensive line has been ravaged just a bit from some of the COVID positive tests and some of the contact tracing. But having said that, he was in the starting lineup from an offensive line perspective. So I think that, helps to bridge a little bit of the gap on the lack of depth that you have on the offensive side of the ball. Defensively, I think the defensive line probably would be my biggest concern. You lost Neville Gallimore and a couple of other guys who played really good ball last year for Oklahoma. Junior college transfer Perion Winfrey is going to be counted on as a starter pretty much at the beginning of the year. Defensive line coach Calvin Thibodeau really kind of talked about his leadership. He looks the part, just got to do it when the lights come on, type of thing. Linebacker, again, maybe a little bit of a less of a concern, but still a concern when you talk about losing Kenneth Murray. And then obviously Caleb Kelly was lost early in the year to another ACL injury. So I think those two would be the biggest concerns that I would see on the defensive side of the ball as we go into this season.
Got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football to break down Oklahoma football, with the Sooners about 8 days away from their opener, and the rest of the Big 12, of course, chasing the boys from Norman. What comes to mind here in trying to determine, okay, who could challenge Oklahoma is some of us bought into the Texas rise after winning the Sugar Bowl and playing a close game against Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship game, and, of course, winning the regular season matchup 2 years ago. And they proceeded to lose 5 games and not challenge Oklahoma. But besides that little uprising by the Longhorns, of course, Oklahoma's owned the conference for just about 10 years. And TCU and Baylor had their time there in 2013 and 14, but for the last 6 or 7 years, it's been Oklahoma and trying to figure out who could possibly challenge them. So in a season which there is a lot of hype around Oklahoma State in the offseason, Texas, of course, has the best talent. Right. Who do you think could jump up and why?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like, Mark, this could be a year that the chalk kind of holds true. As you mentioned, Texas and Oklahoma State are the two favorites to challenge Oklahoma this year. Last year you had Baylor, which pretty much came out of nowhere. No one really, thought of them as being a contender on the national stage or even the Big 12 stage. And then, obviously we know Oklahoma came from behind in that game, and then really, really tight overtime game in the Big 12 championship game. I think for me, I would slightly lean Oklahoma State, and really, Mark, just because of how good they look on the offensive side of the ball. Spencer Sanders coming into his sophomore year was really, was pretty solid true freshman year for Oklahoma State last year. The last part of his year was cut short because of an injury. Did throw 11 interceptions, so I think that's going to be one of the things that he's going to need to cut down on. But you have two of the two best players at their position in the Big 12, if not the country, and Chuba Hubbard and Tylan Wallace, both at the running back and wide receiver position, respectively. I think the thing that that goes against Oklahoma State and really kind of the question around them, two questions that that come to mind. can Mike Gundy get over the hump against Oklahoma? He's only won twice. I think he's 2-13 against Oklahoma in his career in Oklahoma State. And then you have, the fact that they come to Norman. Can they beat Oklahoma in Norman? I know home field advantage isn't probably what it has been in the past, and may not really make a whole lot of difference. In the season. And then you got, obviously just a slight edge is they do have Texas in Stillwater this year. But, Texas is replacing a lot, specifically at the receiver position. But, they got Sim Ehlinger back for his 15th year in Austin, I think. So he's a leader. He's a gamer. He's one of those guys that you almost you can't root against because of how tough he is. From a playmaker perspective, and he's progressed his time in Texas. Texas has got a lot of changes, both new. You led with that in the beginning, talking about new offensive coordinators and new defensive coordinators. They have both a new offensive coordinator and a new defensive coordinator at Texas. They only have a couple of weeks to kind of get out those kinks and stuff before they're the schedule tightens up on their side. So if we were to look at someone on the outside looking in, I think Iowa State is probably the only one that I could see that could seriously challenge either one of them. They do host Oklahoma. I believe they host Texas and go to Oklahoma State. And from a scheduling perspective, Brock Purdy is one of the best. He's probably, coming in. He's right there with Ehlinger as one of the best quarterbacks returning in the Big 12. And, they get as much out of that team, out of their talent as any coach in the country. So, Oklahoma struggled against them the last few years, barely escaping last year. With a win, and of course, a couple of years ago, Iowa State kind of shocked Oklahoma before Iowa State was kind of back on the map in Norman in that shocking win. So that outside of Oklahoma State and Texas, Iowa State probably looks to me like the only ones that could legitimately challenge Oklahoma to get back to that Big 12 championship game.
Yeah, TCU entered the league, took a bit of a hit in its adjustment to the Big 12 for a year or two, and then took off and had a top program in the country. And now after, it was the 2017 Big 12 championship game in which they had a nice year, lost to the Sooners twice that season, but still finished in the top 10 or 12 in the nation, that they've dropped off the last couple of years. I think Gary Patterson's biggest issue is finding a quarterback that can play at the level that he needs to play anywhere in college football, but especially in that league, you need to have somebody who can pull the trigger and put up 30 or 35 touchdown passes.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Mark, is they were starting to get a guy in Max Dugan last year, played really well for them. It looks like he's out for at least part of the year. I think he had mentioned this was an undisclosed injury. Not exactly sure if it was COVID. I don't know that it's COVID related. I think it's outside of that, but had some sort of medical condition that's going to keep him out at least part of the year. So, I think it goes back to the drawing board for TCU. I think your point is, absolutely critical. It's a quarterback league. It's a quarterback, FBS, in terms of, you can't win a championship, whether it's at the national level or the conference level, without really good quarterback play this year. In any year. So I think it's critical for whoever it is, if it's TCU, if it's whoever is trying to come up, is really having a good quarterback that can kind of lead the team.
And Chris Kleiman with a heck of a debut season in Manhattan, Kansas, with the Wildcats, going 8-4 in the regular season with a narrow loss in a bowl game to finish 8-5. So we'll see what he has in store. Although Kansas State always working off that talent deficit and trying to challenge Oklahoma and Texas. Big 12 could be interesting, or it could be just an Oklahoma onslaught again this year, but we will have hopefully a championship game, as we are all looking to not just see football kick off in the next few days, but also conclude with championship games in the conferences and, of course, a college football playoff. Jason Ray, last word on college football. Please check out his work right there, and the rest of the crew that supports us so well here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. All right, Jason, enjoy the football, and hopefully we'll talk some Oklahoma here soon.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Mark. I appreciate it.